I hid my identity to take an entry-level job at my husband's company. When lunchtime rolled around, I casually picked up his water tumbler and took a sip. His executive assistant charged at me instantly. "How dare you drink from my husband's cup?" she shrieked. My actual husband, standing just steps away, panicked completely. Sterling Dynamics was my father's life's work. From a tiny, cramped electronics repair garage in a gritty San Jose alleyway, Richard Sterling had traded sweat, tears, and his own blood to build a Silicon Valley tech conglomerate with an estimated valuation approaching $10 billion. When he passed away, the crushing weight of that massive fortune and the livelihoods of thousands of employees fell squarely onto my shoulders. I was his only daughter, a woman, accustomed only to Ivy League libraries, high society charity galas, and the careful, sheltered protection of my family. That was when Julian entered the picture, appearing as an unshakable anchor. He was a young, charismatic chief operating officer from a modest, middle-class background. He was articulate, persuasive, and seemed to deeply understand the corduroy, immense burdens I was carrying. We were married in a lavish ceremony that the tech world envied. I handed over my father's legacy to my husband like a priceless dowry, willingly stepping back to play the role of the devoted, supportive wife. Day in and day out, I lingered in our sprawling Atherton estate, meticulously managing his wardrobe and curating his meals. I foolishly thought my sacrifices and unwavering devotion would buy me a peaceful home and a dedicated husband who would pour his heart into his wife's, a family empire. I had trusted him with absolute executive power at the corporation, retaining only my title as the majority shareholder on paper. But life rarely bends to our wishes, and human greed is a bottomless pit. 3 years passed. Julian's business trips multiplied. The nights he came, home reeking of top-shelf whiskey and unfamiliar, heavy perfumes increased in direct proportion to the company's surging revenue. His gentle, caring check-ins vanished, replaced by irritability and constant excuses about corporate pressure to avoid our family dinners. A woman's intuition told me something was terribly wrong. Traditional vows speak of standing by your partner through thick and thin, but when a man shows signs of deceit, a woman cannot simply close her eyes. I refused to sit quietly in my dumb mansion waiting to be fed lies. Using one of my late father's old connections in the HR department, I fabricated a resume and applied for a job at my own company. As a low-level administrative assistant, I needed to see with my own eyes how my husband was running the company, how he treated his staff, and who he truly was. When my back was turned, on my first day, I locked away my designer dresses and expensive jewelry. I wore a plain, off-the-rack white button-down shirt from a generic department store, dark slacks, and pulled my hair up into a messy bun secured with a cheap plastic claw clip. Not a single soul in that magnificent, glass-walled headquarters recognized Eleanor Sterling, the once famous heiress of the Sterling family. The morning dragged on with mundane tasks, making copies, brewing coffee, clearing out conference rooms. By early afternoon, the office manager ordered me to bring an iced Americano up to the CEO's suite. Carrying the tray, walking down the familiar plush-carpeted hallway, where my father used to hold my hand. When I was a little girl, an indescribable emotion swelled in my chest. The heavy mahogany door to the CEO's office was slightly ajar, leaving a narrow sliver of light. I raised my hand to knock, but froze when I heard the sounds. Coming from inside, a woman's voice, sharp, flirty, and grating, echoed in the Fink's room. I recognized it instantly. Chloe, the bombshell executive assistant Julian had personally hired 6 months ago. She was speaking in a piercing, mocking tone. She was trashing the trophy wife, sitting at home, calling her a useless parasite leeching off her husband's glory. She laughed about how the wife stayed cooped up in the kitchen, utterly clueless about the cutthroat reality of the business world. Chloe arrogantly declared that she was the true right-hand woman, the modern partner who actually deserved to stand beside the CEO and conquer new heights with him. I stood paralyzed, the plastic tray shaking violently in my hands. I waited for Julian to cut her off, to reprimand his insolent assistant and defend the honor of his legal wife, the woman who had handed him the keys to her family's kingdom. But no defense came. Instead, Julian's low, mocking chuckle filled the air. He chimed in, agreeing with his mistress. He complained that I was a bland, flavorless woman, clinging to boring, old-fashioned morals. He whined that living with me was like living with a wooden board, and that the only reason he had endured it for so many years was to gain the absolute trust of the Board of Two Thing, directors through the chairman's daughter Halo. He then fed Chloe the sweetest of promises. He swore that, in just a little, while, once everything was perfectly aligned, he would kick me to the curb, give Chloe her rightful title, and proudly walk her into high society. The iced coffee sloshed wildly on the tray, a few freezing drops spilling onto the back of my hand, chilling me to the bone. Every word they exchanged felt like a sharpened butcher knife hacking away at Leixire. The blind trust and foolish sacrifices I had made over the past 3 years. My kindness had been their favorite joke. I took a deep breath, swallowing the bitter lump forming in my throat. I absolutely refused to let a single tear fall. At my age, faced with the agonizing pain of ultimate betrayal, you don't cry like a naive child. The deeper the pain, the more terrifyingly lucid my mind became. I reached out my freezing hand and shoved the heavy mahogany door wide open. It hit the wall with a dull, heavy thud that echoed through the massive executive suite. The two people inside jumped out of their skins, scrambling away from each other, like thieves caught red-handed. Julian frantically smoothed his hair, clumsily, adjusting the lapels of his custom Tom Ford suit. Chloe shot up from the leather sofa, her heavily contoured face flashing a brief moment of panic. But mere seconds later, when her eyes locked onto the generic admin badge pinned to my cheap shirt, she regained her haughty composure, lifting her chin and glaring at me with daggers in her eyes. I walked in, keeping my face entirely blank, deliberately staring down at the imported wool rug. I played the role of the timid, terrified admin cowed by executive authority perfectly. I approached the solid oak desk and carefully placed the iced Americano onto a coaster. Chloe cleared her throat aggressively and marched over, slamming her hand onto the desk. She berated me loudly with the most condescending language imaginable. She tore into the incompetent administrative staff, screaming about how I had no manners, barging in without knocking, completely blind to whether the CEO was busy. She waved her hand dismissively at my clothes, sneering that my pathetic, cheap outfit was polluting the sophisticated atmosphere of the executive suite. She threatened to report me to HR and have my pay docked for my sheer ignorance. I kept my head bowed, murmuring apologies, taking 2 steps back exactly as a reprimanded subordinate should. But right as she threw her hand up to point in my face, the crystal chandelier above caught something. A blinding flash of light from her ring finger pierced my eyes. I looked closer, and it felt as though my feet grew roots into the drawed-up carpet. My entire body went rigid as a wave of absolute, freezing horror washed over me. On Chloe's hand sat a massive diamond ring, but it was absolutely not a mass-produced piece from a standard jewelry store. It featured a white gold rose, wrapping around a rare blue diamond center, the intricate leaves and vines, flowing in a unique, unmistakable pattern. It was the exact design I had painstakingly sketched late at night for weeks. It was the blueprint for our 3rd anniversary rings, a design I had locked away in my personal biometric safe at home, planning to take it to a master jeweler in the Diamond District next month. How did my top-secret design turn into a physical ring sitting smugly on the proponent too? A finger of his little mistress? There was only one answer. Julian had secretly memorized my passcode, opened my private safe, stolen his wife's heartfelt design, and had it custom-made for another woman. This betrayal was no longer just the standard infidelity of a straying, greedy man, swiping his wife's anniversary design for his mistress, humiliating her, behind her back, promising a future to the other woman. This crossed far beyond the boundaries of normal deceit. I realized a much more horrifying truth. They weren't just sleeping together. They were executing a systematic, vicious conspiracy. Chloe wasn't just some gold digger looking for a few expensive handbags. She was a cunning parasite waiting to kick the rightful owner out of the nest and claim the entire empire. Julian, utterly blinded by lust, was plotting with his mistress to hijack Sterling Dynamics, the very company my father had bled to build. I turned on my heel and walked out, pulling the door shut as quietly as possible. Walking down the silent hallway, I heard the sharp, rhythmic click of my own heels against the cold marble floor. The initial explosion of rage had evaporated completely, replaced by a terrifyingly cold, clinical composure. The enemy had revealed their true, shameless faces. I could no longer play the docile, oblivious wife. I had to protect my father's legacy with my own two hands, at any cost. I would show them that Richard Sterling's daughter was not a weak, pathetic woman easily trampled on. This life-or-death war officially began the moment that mahogany door clicked shut. Lunch hour at the Sterling Dynamics headquarters was always the most chaotic time of day. The massive cafeteria on the 6th floor was clearly divided into two distinct zones, a cruel reflection of corporate hierarchy. On one side were rows of standard laminate tables packed with hundreds of regular employees. On the other side was a VIP section with plush leather booths, ambient lighting, and high-end table settings reserved strictly for upper management. I carried my simple tray, a basic quinoa bowl and tomato soup, and walked through the deafening chatter of the standard tables. My eyes, however, weren't on my food. They were locked dead onto the plush leather booths. Chloe was sitting there, legs crossed, radiating the arrogance of an actual queen. She was surrounded by a few sycophantic team leads who were practically feeding her grapes, fetching her napkins, and pouring her drinks. Sitting right in the middle of her glass table was a matte black Yeti tumbler, custom engraved, with an elegant V for Vance. Seeing that tumbler made my blood boil. I had specially ordered it from an artisan overseas, customizing it for Julian to take to work every day. For a mere assistant to openly display the CEO's highly personal item on her lunch table in front of subordinates was a blatant, shameless assertion of dominance. They had lost all respect for boundaries, brazenly flaunting their filthy affair. In broad daylight, I took a long, deep breath, regulating my heart rate until it slowed down. Then, I pivoted sharply, taking firm, steady strides directly toward the VIP management section. As I passed Chloe's table, I purposely stopped. Every pair of sycophantic eyes locked onto me, flashing annoyance and blatant disgust. A lowly admin daring to approach the VIP section was the ultimate corporate taboo. Here, I calmly set my food tray down on the empty table next to hers. Then I reached out, grabbed the matte black Yeti tumbler, unscrewed the lid, and took a massive gulp. The organic black cold brew inside was still perfectly chilled. The familiar, slightly bitter taste brewed by my own hands at 5 a.m. that morning washed over my tongue. The air around us instantly turned to ice. The team leads stared with their jaws, unhinged, unable to comprehend the sheer audacity unfolding before them. Chloe's heavily made-up eyes bulged out of her head, her contoured face flushing crimson with explosive rage. Her colossal ego had just been trampled. She shot up from the booth, violently swinging her arm and slapping my lunch tray right off the table. Ceramic bowls shattered deafeningly across the cafeteria. Tomato soup and quinoa splattered everywhere across the tiled floor. The deafening noise caused hundreds of employees to jolt and turn their heads. The entire cafeteria fell into a dead silence. The only sound left was the faint, corporate pop music playing through the ceiling speakers. Chloe lunged at me like a rabid animal. Without a second of hesitation, she delivered a vicious, ringing slap directly across my face. The smack echoed sharply. My left cheek burned instantly, my ear ringing from the sheer force of her swing. I stumbled back half a step to keep my balance. A faint metallic taste of blood pooled in the corner of my mouth, mixing with the bitterness of the cold brew. Hands on her hips, Chloe shoved her finger bearing that stolen custom diamond ring right in my face. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, using the most vulgar, classless language imaginable. She called me a filthy, bottom-feeding rat, asking if I had a death wish touching the CEO's personal belongings. She screamed, her voice echoing over the hundreds of watching employees, that it was her husband's water. She shrieked that a pathetic nobody like me had no right to even look at it, let alone touch it. The entire cafeteria held its breath. Not a single person dared to speak up or defend me. They looked at me with deep pity, mixed with absolute terror of the CEO's untouchable future wife. I stood up straight, slowly using the back of my hand to wipe the streak of blood from the corner of my mouth. The stinging pain on my skin didn't bother me in the slightest. On the contrary, this resounding slap was the exact, perfect detonator I had been waiting for all morning. Chloe's arrogance and sheer stupidity had reached their peak, and she had just dug her own grave in front of, the entire company. The crowd of employees instinctively parted, creating a narrow walkway leading to the elevators. From the main entrance of the cafeteria, Julian was sprinting toward us, having heard the crashing plates and his mistress's screeching. Echoing all the way down the hall, he was forced to appear as the head of the Hernant company to put out the fire and save face for the executive board. Initially, Julian's face carried the irritated scowl of a CEO interrupted during his precious lunch hour. He parted the crowd with authority, striding right into the epicenter of the chaos. But as his annoyed gaze swept over the war zone, the shattered bowls, the puddles of soup, and slowly traveled up to the figure of the woman standing perfectly straight, holding a swelling red cheek. In his feet, suddenly slammed to a halt as if he had stepped on a landmine. Every ounce of blood drained from Julian's handsome face in a fraction of a dried second. He turned the ashen gray of an unburied corpse. His pupils shrank too. Pinpricks, locked in absolute terror onto my emotionless face. The towering, imposing figure of the CEO suddenly went rigid, like a stone statue carved in the middle of the hall. His hands, hanging limply at his sides, began to shake violently, his fingers curling inward in sheer panic. Chloe, entirely blinded by her power-tripping rage, didn't notice the horrifying transformation on her lover's face. Seeing her ultimate protector arrive, she escalated her performance as the victim. She ran over, wrapping herself around Julian's arm, pressing her chest against his shoulder like a spoiled child. Pointing her finger right at me, she screeched at Julian to call security, and I have this insane bitch thrown out of the building immediately. She wailed that I was trying to publicly humiliate her, that I was a piece of trash trying to climb the corporate ladder by touching the CEO's things. But Julian was completely deaf to her demands. He didn't answer. He didn't offer a single comforting gesture to Chloe. He looked like a man whose throat was being crushed by the Grim Reaper. His mouth opened and closed like a dying fish, but he couldn't produce a single, coherent sound to salvage the situation. His eyes, staring at me, were overflowing with pure, unadulterated dread. He knew exactly who the woman in the cheap white shirt was. The woman his mistress had just slapped in front of hundreds of people wasn't some nameless administrative temp. It was Eleanor Sterling, the woman holding the absolute, controlling shares of the conglomerate. The true owner of the CEO chair he was currently keeping warm. And, most importantly, his legal, devoted wife, the woman he firmly believed was safely at home in Atherton, arranging flowers and waiting to serve him dinner. I dropped my hand from my cheek, revealing the stark, red outline of 5 fingers branded onto my pale skin. I kept my head held high, staring deep into Julian's violet-like trembling eyes. The corners of my mouth slowly curled upward, into a cold, contemptuous smile. That smile was an ironclad death sentence for his career and his reputation. I didn't cry. I didn't scream or throw a hysterical fit like a woman who had lost her mind. I used a silence, as sharp as a guillotine blade, to sever every single nerve in the traitor's panicked brain. Julian took a step back, swallowing hard, beads of cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. Their filthy game of hide-and-seek was over. It was my turn to control the board. The air in the cafeteria was pulled as tight as a piano wire. Hundreds of people held their breath, watching the bizarre drama unfold. Chloe stubbornly stomped her Louboutins against the tile, shaking Julian's arm furiously, demanding he fire me on the spot to make an example out of me. Seeing Julian glued to the basin floor like a soulless ghost, pale and mute, Chloe growled in frustration and lunged forward, preparing to slap me a second time to vent her rage. This time, Julian completely snapped out of his paralysis. As the apocalyptic consequences of her actions finally registered, his survival instincts kicked in. He violently yanked Chloe's arm back so hard that she lost her balance and nearly tumbled backward onto the floor. Chloe stared at Julian in absolute shock, stretching her neck to scream at him, demanding to know why he was stopping her from teaching a disrespectful grunt a lesson. Chloe's boundless arrogance had turned her into the worst actress in a cheap comedy, making her a laughingstock in front of everyone. I reached up, casually tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear, stood up, incredibly straight, and raised my voice. I spoke slowly, my tone so clear and commanding that it echoed to the very back of the massive cafeteria, ensuring every single employee heard every single syllable. Looking directly into Chloe's face, I loudly reminded the bombshell assistant that the title of husband she had just proudly screamed in public was invoked far too early and far too incorrectly. I can assure you, I announced with ironclad certainty, that the legal wife of CEO Julian Vance, the only woman named on the marriage certificate issued by the Curzons, State of California, and the legitimate daughter-in-law of the Vance family, is an entirely different woman. You, at your core, are nothing but a shameless mistress inserting yourself to destroy another family's home. Under what legal authority are you demanding my termination? What right do you have to act like a tyrant in Sterling Dynamics, as if this company belongs to you? The crowd erupted. Whispers and gasps exploded through the room like a kicked beehive. The sheer volume of information I had just dropped was unfathomable to the rank-and-file corporate workers. The eyes that had looked at me with pity moments ago swiveled to Chloe, filled with morbid curiosity, disgust, and open mockery. The future CEO's wife persona she had bought and paid for with company money shattered into humiliating shards of glass, shredding her dignity. Julian was so terrified his teeth were literally chattering. He couldn't maintain eye contact with me for another second. The absolute terror of losing his CEO title, losing the massive wealth he was siphoning, and losing every ounce of his reputation completely crushed the cheating bastard's inflated ego. Ignoring Chloe's violent thrashing and her hysterical sobbing demanding an undernay explanation, Julian gripped her wrist like an iron vice. With brute force, he dragged her out of the cafeteria, practically running, looking exactly like a guilty criminal fleeing a raging inferno. Watching the pathetic, cowardly backs of the two traitors disappear, I casually brushed a speck of dirt off my white sleeve. My first counterattack had landed flawlessly. I had mercilessly crushed their fake pride in front of the entire company. But in my heart, I knew this was just the overture. A little public. Humiliation was nothing. It wasn't nearly enough to pay for my father's lifeblood that they were conspiring to destroy. I turned and walked away, my posture proud and unshakable beneath the shell-shocked gazes of the crowd, mentally preparing for the legal bloodbath that was about to follow. As soon as Julian and Chloe's panicked figures vanished behind the elevator doors, the cafeteria was still buzzing with shock. Donna, the middle-aged HR director, urgently pushed her way through the crowd and pulled me by the arm into a secluded corner near the fire escape. Donna was a Sterling Dynamics 2 veteran, having been with my father since his startup days. She was a gentle soul who always tried to keep the peace and avoided office politics at all costs. She let go of my arm and let out a heavy, exhausted sigh, her face etched with profound worry and pity. She lowered her voice, pleading with me to go back to my desk, type up my resignation letter this afternoon, and leave the building before I brought ruin upon myself. According to Donna, Chloe wasn't just the CEO's pampered mistress. She had completely manipulated the HR structure, holding the power to hire and fire at will, ruthlessly crushing anyone who stood in her way. Donna told me I was foolish to poke a sleeping bear. A lowly admin on probation could never, ever win against untouchable executive power. I stood quietly, absorbing Donna's genuine concern. She had absolutely no idea who the small woman standing in front of her actually was, or what kind of iron blood ran in her veins. Instead of defending myself, I calmly reached into my slacks and pulled out my smartphone. The screen lit up. I tapped the screen, playing the audio file I had secretly recorded. The entire confrontation played back perfectly from Chloe's vulgar, classless insults to the deafening crash of ceramic bowls shattering on the tile, right up to the sharp, violent smack of her hand across my face. The recording was so high definition, you could hear the murderous breathing of the 5'7" mistress as she swung. Donna's face turned paper white, her lips trembled. She didn't dare utter another word of warning. Having worked in HR for decades, She knew exactly how legally devastating this evidence of corporate assault and verbal abuse was. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, gave Donna a polite nod, and turned away, taking long, confident strides back to the cramped, supply closet turned office at the end of the third-floor hallway. The room smelled of shredded paper, stale toner, and the suffocating air of backlogged files. I pulled up the squeaky office chair and sat down in front of the outdated desktop computer. I plugged my encrypted personal USB drive into the port. The screen flickered. I created a multi-layered, password-protected folder, carefully transferred the audio file, and named it clearly. Evidence 01. Illicit affair and physical assault. Step 1 of my plan to overthrow the parasites was complete. I had promised myself I would never lower my standards to a screaming, hair-pulling screaming match in the streets like an uneducated fool. I was the only daughter of Richard Sterling, a man who built a billion-dollar empire on sheer intellect and an iron will. I was going to use transparent corporate law, the cutthroat rules of Silicon Valley, and ironclad evidence to strip them of everything they had stolen. They thought I was just a weak, spineless woman, a porcelain doll living off her husband's halo. They were dead wrong. Now that my ultimate boundary had been shredded, I was going to turn into a hurricane and purge every piece of trash from this company. The net was cast perfectly, trapping the rats chewing away at my father's legacy. When he was alive, my father was a visionary who always anticipated the treacherous traps of the business world. Shortly before he succumbed to his illness, he called me into his private study and secretly handed me a master-level administrative token, a digital backdoor that not even the current chief technology officer of Sterling Dynamics knew existed. This supreme access allowed me to bypass firewalls and pull data from every corner of the company, from internal emails to the master accounting ledgers, without leaving a single digital footprint. Late that afternoon, when the administrative floor was completely deserted, I sat alone in the dim office. I plugged the authentication token into the computer and typed in a complex 64-character passcode. The screen instantly shifted to a silent black and green command terminal. The audit protocol was active. I began sweeping through 3 years' worth of Julian's email history, internal, Slack messages, and expense approvals. The numbers and documents flooding the fraud screen made my stomach churn with physical disgust. Human greed was a weapon, deadlier than any gun. I downloaded receipts for presidential suites at thebossdefivance.com, Ritz-Carlton downtown, invoices for crocodile skin Birkin bags, and receipts for diamond-encrusted Rolexes. All of this degenerate luxury had been carefully disguised by Julian as client entertainment, blatantly embezzling the corporate travel fund. In their internal company chats, they didn't even try to hide it, shamelessly calling each other hubby and wifey in corporate channels. I compiled all of it, saving it to the secure drive as evidence 02. But the rot went much deeper than using company credit cards as a slush fund. I dug further into the cash flow of our joint venture investments. Tens of millions of dollars from Sterling Dynamics had been directly approved by Julian and wired into 3 newly formed private media consulting firms under the private guise of brand marketing contracts. I copied the tax IDs and immediately cross-referenced them with the Delaware State Corporate Registry. The veil dropped. The registered agents and legal representatives for all 3 of these shell LLCs shared the last name Bennett, sharing the same residential address in Nevada. They perfectly matched the names of Chloe's biological brother and mother. The company's core capital was being alibi, systematically, illegally siphoned off in a highly sophisticated, large-scale operation. This was no longer just a case of decaying family morals. This was felony, embezzlement, intentional corporate fraud, and massive financial theft. I meticulously took screenshots of the bank statements and fake contracts, saving them as evidence 03. The crime of wire fraud and illegal asset transfer was clear as day, more than enough to send them both to federal prison for decades. As I clicked through the filthy files, my 3 years of patience felt like the ultimate insult to my father's memory. Once the financial evidence was safely on my USB drive, I prepared to disconnect until I remembered one final secret. Before he died, Paranoid about corporate espionage and stolen source code, my father had his most trusted security team install a microscopic, hidden camera inside the crystal chandelier of the CEO's office. This device operated entirely off the grid, transmitting directly to an isolated private server. Ironically, today, this state-of-the-art security system was about to be my greatest weapon. In exposing the monster my father had taken under his wing, I accessed the private video server and filtered the footage to the last 3 months. I fast-forwarded through boring meetings until my finger froze on a recording from late at night, exactly 2 months ago. In high-definition 4K, Julian and Chloe appeared on screen. They were tangled, together on the $20,000 Italian leather sofa, right in the middle of the office. The audio was crystal clear. Chloe was stroking Julian's chest, using a whiny, petulant voice to pressure him into kicking his boring old wife to the curb so she could move into the mansion. She complained she didn't want to be the secret mistress anymore, didn't want to share her man. Julian kissed her neck and made a promise with chilling certainty. His words were so ruthless, so cold-blooded, they sent ice water down my spine. He told her he was aggressively prepping for a massive Series E funding round from Apollo Ventures. He explicitly promised his mistress that the moment the billion-dollar wire hit the Sterling Dynamics accounts, he would use their shell companies to completely gut the company's assets, leaving Sterling Dynamics an empty, debt-ridden husk. Once the money was completely hidden offshore, he would use legal blackmail to force me to sign a divorce agreement, leaving me with nothing. He referred to his devoted wife as a stupid roadblock that needs to be bulldozed. This one 5-minute video was the most damning proof of the animalistic greed inside. In them, I saved the unedited HD file as evidence 04. Staring at the now black screen, I realized that whatever lingering affection or marital loyalty I had left in my heart had been incinerated into ash. There was no room for forgiveness. I pulled the USB from the drive and slipped it deep into a hidden pocket of my purse. The nets were set at every intersection. Now, it was time to haul in the catch and drag these criminals into the blinding light of justice to pay for what they had done. Dusk settled, and the streetlights of San Francisco flickered to life. After clocking out, I didn't take a car back to the Atherton mansion. I flagged a taxi and headed straight to an exclusive, quiet tea lounge hidden away in Nob Hill. The air inside smelled faintly of sandalwood and expensive matcha. Marcus Sullivan was already waiting for me at a mahogany table in the back corner. Marcus wasn't just a ruthless corporate litigator. He was my father's oldest friend, the man who had fought in the trenches with him since day one. He currently served as the independent general counsel for Sterling Dynamics, the ultimate guardian of the company's integrity. I walked into the private room, nodded to the man I viewed as an uncle, and carefully placed the encrypted USB drive on the table. In a low, steady voice, I summarized the disgusting events that had unfolded in the cafeteria that afternoon. Then, I asked Marcus to plug the drive into his laptop and review the clays, financial evidence, and the security footage himself. The calm, experienced eyes of the veteran lawyer slowly burned with volcanic rage as he read through the sophisticated wire transfers. When he heard Julian's venomous plot in the security video, he slammed his fist down onto the mahogany table. He cursed Julian as a treacherous, ungrateful dog, a parasite that bites the hand that feeds it. I calmly poured a cup of hot tea and offered it to him with both hands, maintaining my icy composure. I laid out my battle plan with absolute clarity. There would be zero mercy. Goal 1. Julian is stripped of his title and leaves. Sterling Dynamics with nothing, forced to pay full restitution. Goal 2. I officially step out of the shadows, reclaim my position as the majority shareholder, and take total control of the company before the Apollo Ventures. Deal. Goal 3. Finalize the criminal complaint with the FBI and the DA to put Chloe and every accomplice in her shell companies behind bars. Marcus nodded in absolute agreement, his eyes gleaming with admiration for the fierce woman I had become. He promised to stay up all night at his firm to draft a unilateral divorce petition with the most brutal, unforgiving terms possible. Simultaneously, he would compile a confidential brief for the board of directors, demanding an immediate freeze on all executive assets. We agreed on the exact moment the guillotine would drop, An emergency board of connection. Directors meeting convened first thing tomorrow morning. I thanked Marcus and walked out of the lounge, feeling like a warrior stepping onto the bloodiest battlefield of her life. The clock struck exactly 10 p.m. when my Uber pulled up to the massive iron gates of my Atherton estate. This house had once been my dream home, but as I pushed the front door open, it felt as cold and sterile as a tomb burying my wasted youth. I walked through the foyer and straight into the cavernous living room. Julian was sitting on the expensive sofa. The glass ashtray on the coffee table was overflowing with half-smoked cigarettes. Seeing me walk in, he immediately crushed his cigarette and stood up, pasting on his familiar, fake, caring expression. He walked quickly toward me, holding out a tube of expensive, imported burn ointment. He lowered his voice to a soothing, apologetic register, trying to explain that the incident at lunch was just a terrible misunderstanding. He dumped all the blame entirely onto his mistress. He claimed Chloe was immature, impulsive, and cracking under corporate pressure, which was why she acted so violently. He swore up and down that tomorrow morning he would personally drag her into his office, scream at her, and force her to get on her knees and apologize to me to restore my honor. He played the role of the helpless, heartbroken husband devastated to see his beloved wife bullied by a subordinate. I crossed my arms over my chest, refusing to take the tube of ointment coated in his filthy lies. I stood perfectly still, staring at him coldly as he finished his pathetic performance. When he finally stopped talking, I spoke, my voice ringing like steel. "What exactly is the misunderstanding here?" I asked. "Is the misunderstanding you opening my private biometric safe and turning my anniversary ring design into an engagement ring for your mistress? Or is the misunderstanding your master plan to set up Delaware shell companies, drain the corporate accounts, and force me into a divorce so you can throw me onto the street with nothing?" Hearing my razor-sharp words dissecting his soul, Julian froze in absolute terror. The ointment dropped from his hand, bouncing on the rug. The fake, caring smile plastered on his face shattered. His eyes bugged out in sheer panic. I slowly unzipped my purse, pulled out a stack of high-res color photographs, and threw them onto the glass coffee table. They were screenshots from the security footage, clearly showing him rolling around with his cheap mistress, plotting his corporate coup. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice devoid of a single drop of emotion. I issued my ultimatum, telling him to prepare to face the wrath of the law. The masquerade of the perfect husband officially ended here, making way for severe punishment. The living room was so silent you could hear the hum of the HVAC system. Julian bent down, his hands trembling violently as he picked up the photos. The longer he looked, the more his face shifted from pale terror to a violent, humiliating, crimson rage. The true animalistic nature of a greedy man backed into a corner finally clawed its way out. He slammed the photos onto the table, stood up, and glared at me, his demeanor completely morphing. He pointed his finger inches from my face and snarled. He called me a vicious, scheming bitch for spying on my own husband. He beat his chest, bragging that for the last 3 years, if it hadn't been for him, working 8 0-hour weeks, Sterling Dynamics would have gone bankrupt. He was completely delusional, believing he was the ultimate savior, the true king who owned everything. He arrogantly declared that every single voting member of the current executive board was in his pocket. A sheltered housewife like me stood absolutely no chance against him. He demanded I tear up whatever evidence I thought I had and go back to playing the quiet trophy wife, or he would completely bleed me dry and throw me out without a single cent to my name. I laughed out loud. The sound was bright, clear, and filled with bottomless contempt, echoing through the dead of night. I took a step forward, closing the distance, completely unfazed by his feral threats. I stared right into the dark, twisted face of the man I used to call my husband, the man I had given my our heart to. Any remaining love I had was just cold ash. My voice dropped to an icy, commanding register as I issued my final terms. I demanded that before noon tomorrow, he personally sign an indefinite termination order for Chloe Bennett. Furthermore, he was to immediately disclose all marital assets and wire back every single dollar he had embezzled from the corporate accounts. If he complied, I would consider a quiet, out-of-court divorce to save him a shred of dignity in front of the employees. Hearing this, the veins in Julian's neck bulged. He swept his arm across the bronze table, knocking a glass of water to the floor, and rejected my offer with a string of vile profanities. He called me delusional, drunk on non-existent power. He roared at me to get the hell out of his sight tonight, forbidding me from ever stepping foot inside the company building again. I didn't waste another breath on him. I calmly bent down, picked up my purse, turned around, and walked straight out the front door. The steady click of my heels echoed off the driveway pavers. Inside the pocket of my coat, a digital recorder glowed with a solid red light. Every single threat to steal my assets, every arrogant admission of his crimes, had just been captured in high R definition. It was the final nail in an airtight coffin. The next morning, the San Francisco sky was unusually clear. Bright sunlight streamed through the curtains of the luxury hotel suite where I had spent the night. I woke up early, standing in front of the full-length mirror to prepare for war. Today, the timid, plain administrative assistant was dead. I wore a tailored crimson-red power suit. The cut was impeccable feminine, but radiating absolute authority and iron resolve. My black stiletto heels clicked, rhythmically. I wore my hair pulled back into an elegant, severe twist and applied a striking, sharp red lipstick. The true heiress of Sterling Dynamics had finally awakened, ready for battle. At exactly 8 a.m., my black SUV pulled up to the glass pavilion of Sterling Tower. I stepped out, carrying myself with regal confidence, and walked straight through the revolving doors. My stunning transformation left the receptionists staring in open-mouthed shock. Not a single one recognized this terrifyingly elegant woman as the admin who had been slapped in the cafeteria yesterday. Ignoring the bewildered stares, I walked straight to the executive elevators. At that exact moment, the computer screens of thousands of employees simultaneously pinged with an urgent internal HR memo. The email was brief but possessed the destructive force of a bomb. It announced the immediate, indefinite termination of Executive Assistant Chloe Bennett, effective immediately, ordering her to surrender company property and vacate the premises. It hit the corporate hierarchy like a tidal wave. Gossip exploded in every department. But the system wasn't done. A second, highly classified email bypassed the general staff and hit the inboxes of the C-suite and the board of directors. Marcus Sullivan, acting as the independent general counsel, officially called for an emergency, mandatory board of directors meeting that morning. The subject line was bolded in bright red: review of executive misconduct and financial liability of the CEO. The hurricane had made landfall, ripping away the facade of peace. I stepped off the elevator on the top floor, home to the executive boardroom. The hallway was dead silent, save for the echo of my stilettos. In my hand was a thick black leather folder containing the ironclad evidence Marcus and I had finalized overnight. My heart beat in a slow, powerful rhythm. I drew a breath of cold, conditioned air into my lungs, kept my chin high, and marched toward the massive double oak doors. Behind those doors was a den of vipers, and the exact place I would take back my family's empire. The executive assistant guarding the boardroom looked completely panicked when he saw me approaching. He threw his arms out to block the door, stammering apologies, stating that a highly classified executive session was underway. Unauthorized personnel were strictly forbidden. I locked eyes with him, my gaze cutting like a razor. The sheer, crushing aura of authority radiating from the woman in the crimson suit made the assistant physically recoil, his arms dropping to his sides. I glided past him and placed both hands flat against the heavy oak doors, shoving them open with all my strength. The heavy hinges groaned, shattering the suffocating tension inside. The doors banged open. Every single pair of eyes belonging to the most powerful venture, capitalists, board members, and executives, snapped toward the intruder. Sitting at the head of the table was Julian. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night of pure panic. The second he saw me standing there, he reacted like he had been electrocuted. He slammed his fists onto the table, roaring at the top of his lungs, ordering security to drag the trespasser out immediately. I didn't even acknowledge his pathetic, desperate screaming. I took slow, measured, predatory steps right to the center of the massive oval table. I swept my gaze over the veteran board members. Many were older stakeholders, men and women who had bled in the trenches with my father to build this company. They stared at me in shock. A few furrowed their brows, desperately trying to place the familiar facial features of the woman standing before them. I slammed the heavy black leather folder onto the glass table. The sharp crack commanded the room's absolute silence. I stood tall, placed my hands on the glass, and spoke in a booming, crystalline voice. My words carried the play's undeniable weight of absolute power. Allow me to introduce myself to the board. I am Eleanor Sterling, the only daughter of the late Richard Sterling, founder of Sterling Dynamics. I am the legal representative and sole owner of 51% of the voting shares of this company, giving me absolute majority control. And finally, I paused, letting the silence ring. I am the sole legal wife of CEO Julian Vance. The boardroom dropped into a silence so profound it was sickening. My declaration instantly vaporized the fraudulent empire Julian had spent 3 years building, flipping the chessboard entirely. Julian looked as if a sniper had just shot him in the head. His body locked up, his jaw clenched so hard, I thought his teeth would shatter. He opened his mouth to shout, but his throat was completely paralyzed. He couldn't form a single word to save his life. The veteran board members erupted into chaos. Bob Harrison, the vice chairman, and my father's closest confidant, shot up out of his chair. He pushed his reading glasses up, his eyes welling with tears as he finally recognized my father's fierce spirit staring back at him. I didn't waste a second. I opened the black folder and began sliding copies of the evidence across the glass to every board member. The sound of shuffling paper filled the room. Standing center stage, my voice as sharp as a scalpel, I methodically laid out every single one of Julian's federal crimes. I presented the bank wire transfers, proving how tens of millions from our R&D reserves were illegally diverted into 3 fake marketing LLCs. I highlighted the corporate registry documents proving these shell companies belonged to the corporate family of his mistress, Chloe Bennett. The filthy truth of him siphoning company blood to fund his affair was documented in black and white, stamped by federal banks. The older board members, especially Bob, turned purple with rage. Bob's hands shook violently as he gripped the papers. He slammed them down and pointed a trembling finger at Julian, screaming at him, calling him a treacherous bastard who dared to steal the lifeblood of the company. Julian was in a state of sheer panic, cold sweat dripping down his face. He thrashed like a drowning man, desperately spewing the most pathetic, ridiculous lies. He shouted that these were standard venture capital investments meant to expand their media footprint before the Apollo funding round. He vehemently denied any conflict of interest. He pointed at me, screaming that I had forged the documents because of a personal, bitter vendetta to ruin his reputation. His shameless gaslighting pushed the tension in the room to its absolute limit. Everyone looked at me, waiting for my final strike. I didn't flinch. The sight of a drowning rat grasping at straws was pathetic. I smiled coldly, pulled my phone from my blazer, and walked casually over to the brain boardroom's AV hub. I plugged in the HDMI cable, mirroring my screen onto the massive projector wall at the head of the table. The projector light cast a harsh glare over Julian's ghostly pale face, creating a brutally poetic scene. I hit play. The 4K security footage lit up the room. There were Julian and Chloe, rolling around on the office sofa just 2 months ago. The ceiling speakers blasted the audio perfectly. Chloe's whiny voice demanded I be kicked out. And then came the kill shot. Julian's cold, calculated voice outlining his master plan. He explicitly bragged about using the billion-dollar Apollo Ventures injection to gut Sterling Dynamics via his shell companies, leaving the company a bankrupt shell, and then forcing me to sign away my assets in a divorce. Hearing his own voice, plotting corporate treason, was the final, fatal stab through the heart of his lies. The boardroom exploded in fury. The neutral board members, who had remained silent, began slamming the table, disgusted by the sheer moral decay and federal crimes of their CEO. Bob Harrison stood tall, his face a mask of pure wrath, demanding an immediate suspension of the meeting to draft a formal legal complaint. Julian lost all ability to fight back. His legs gave out. The towering CEO collapsed back into his leather chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. His pride, his power, and his delusions of billions had been incinerated in exactly 15 minutes. The head of compliance stood up and formally motioned for an immediate, unanimous vote to strip Julian Vance of all executive powers. Furthermore, all physical evidence was to be sealed and handed directly to the FBI's Financial Crime Division. The lethal blow had landed. The traitor had finally received his sentence. Just as the compliance officer called for the vote, the oak doors were violently becalmed and Officer Day shoved open again. Chloe Bennett burst into the room. Her expensive blowout was a rat's nest. Her makeup was smeared with tears, and black mascara ran down her cheeks, completely ignoring the room full of Silicon Valley billionaires and furious executives. She sprinted straight toward Julian, who was slumped in defeat. She grabbed him by the lapels of his suit and shrieked hysterically, demanding he stand up and fight for her. She wailed that HR and corporate security had just marched to her desk, thrown her belongings into a cardboard box, and threatened to drag her out of the building like a common criminal. She violently shook Julian, screaming at him to use his CEO authority to fire the HR director who dared to touch her. Julian slowly raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot, completely wild, like a cornered beast. Instead of pulling her in and whispering sweet promises like he always did, he ground his teeth together, pulled his arm back, and delivered a devastating backhand across Chloe's face. The strike was fueled by pure, concentrated hatred and the desperation of a ruined man. It sent Chloe crashing to the floor, sprawling across the carpet. Julian leaped out of his chair, projecting all his humiliation, rage, and terror onto the woman he blamed for the apocalypse raining down on him. He pointed down at Chloe, screaming the most vile, degrading insults at her. He blamed her for everything, calling her a greedy, stupid parasite who had destroyed his brilliant career. In a desperate, cowardly attempt to save himself, he told the Tulas board that Chloe had seduced him, manipulated him, and masterminded the entire embezzlement scheme. He completely denied loving her, claiming he was just the creation's victim of an aggressive gold digger. Chloe held her swelling cheek, staring in absolute shock at the man who had promised her the world, watching him tear her to pieces to save his own skin. As she lay there, her eyes drifted up to the massive projector screen. The video was paused on an image of them kissing, the audio having just exposed their plot to steal the company. She broke completely. The crushing humiliation of having her future wife fantasy exposed as a cheap criminal affair broke her mind. Chloe screamed like a banshee, scrambling off the floor and lunging at Julian, clawing wildly at his face. She screamed that he was a coward, a pathetic loser, who couldn't take responsibility for his own crimes. The two traitors who had once shared a bed and plotted to steal my family's legacy were now rolling on the boardroom floor, tearing at each other like starving feral dogs fighting over rotting meat. Bob Harrison was utterly disgusted by the vile display. He slammed his hand on the table and roared for security. 6 massive corporate security guards in black suits rushed in. With brutal efficiency, they pinned Julian and Chloe, twisting their arms behind their backs, and dragged them out of the boardroom. Their vicious curses and hysterical sobbing echoed down the hall until the heavy elevator doors finally sealed them away. The massive boardroom returned to its initial silence, but the air was still thick with shock and anger. The trash had been taken out. Now, it was time for me to rebuild the empire my father had forged from the ashes. The humiliating ousting of the CEO and the exposure of massive financial fraud had created a massive power vacuum at the worst possible time. In exactly 1 week, the executive delegation from Apollo Ventures was flying in for the final round of negotiations to inject billions into Sterling Dynamics. This capital was life or death for our AI microchip development. Losing our legal, representative, and CEO right before a mega merger was bound to send the company into a tailspin. Several board members voiced their panic, terrified that the billion-dollar deal would evaporate due to the scandal. I calmly walked forward, straightening the stack of evidence on the glass table. I stood tall, facing the entire board of directors. my voice steady, my posture radiating the unshakable confidence bred into the Sterling bloodline. I proposed a decisive crisis management plan. I nominated Bob Harrison, a man with unimpeachable industry respect, and a founding member, to step in as the CLE's interim chairman of the board. His presence would act as a massive anchor, stabilizing morale and signaling trust to our investors during this volatile transition. As for daily operations, I announced that, as the majority shareholder, I would immediately assume the role of acting CEO. I swore an oath to the board that I would ruthlessly clean up the financial mess Julian left behind, plug every leak, and lead the negotiating team myself to close the Apollo Ventures deal. To prove I wasn't just talking, I had the assistant switch the projector. I flawlessly presented a massive, detailed corporate restructuring plan and a flawlessly presented profit optimization strategy. This was the strategic playbook my father had left me, his ultimate compass, which Marcus and I had spent all night refining for the current market. My razor-sharp metrics, aggressive vision, and ruthless decisiveness completely silenced the word skeptics. Bob Harrison nodded vigorously, pride shining in his eyes for the fierce woman I had become. The head of compliance immediately called for a vote. Every single hand in the room went up. 100% unanimous approval. The resolutions to fire Julian and appoint me were ratified on the spot. The moment the gavel hit the table, Eleanor Sterling officially took the throne. I stepped onto the cutthroat battlefield of Silicon Valley to protect and expand my father's priceless legacy. That very afternoon, I ordered facilities to move my things from the cramped closet on the third floor straight up to the sprawling CEO suite. The first thing I did was hire a specialized biohazard cleaning crew. I ordered them to rip out the $20,000 leather sofa and throw it in the dumpster, and to replace all the window treatments. I refused to let a single filthy trace of those two criminals infect the sacred space where my father had built his dream. A massive internal purge began under my iron-fisted leadership. The news of Julian being stripped of his power and dragged out by security spread like wildfire. The executives who used to kiss his feet and participate in his crossed-end embezzlement ring were plunged into absolute terror. They knew my IT backdoor, had exposed every single branch of their corruption. First thing the next morning, the CFO and a VP of marketing named Thomas stood outside my office, shaking like leaves, pale as ghosts. They carried boxes of black ledger accounting books, voluntarily surrendering the evidence of Julian's illegal orders. They begged for mercy, hoping to cut a deal to save themselves from federal prison. I kept my face like stone as I took the files. I immediately signed their scrady suspension papers, revoking their security clearance, pending a total federal audit. I paid top dollar to bring in two of the Big Four accounting firms, having them work 24/7. Every single penny, every shady receipt from the last 3 years was ripped open and analyzed. The financial bleeding was stopped. The FBI and the banks successfully froze the stolen millions sitting in the Delaware LLCs, initiating the clawback process to return the funds to Sterling. Dynamics. The company underwent a brutal, necessary surgery, cutting out the cancerous tumors that were killing it. Incompetent, corrupt managers were fired and instantly replaced by brilliant, hungry young talent with actual integrity. Despite the massive turnover, the morale of the thousands of employees skyrocketed. A culture of transparency, meritocracy, and ironclad discipline was restored. Sterling Dynamics was like a rusting machine that had just been oiled. It roared back to life, preparing for a massive leap on the NASDAQ. The legal fallout moved with terrifying speed. My divorce was filed in the Maine, California Superior Court and resolved in record time. Armed with Marcus's ruthless litigation and indisputable proof of gross infidelity and marital asset theft, Julian was utterly destroyed. The judge stripped him of all claims to the Atherton estate. On top of that, he was ordered to pay millions in civil, restitution, and emotional damages, leaving him with a mountain of debt. But the civil court was nothing compared to the criminal nightmare awaiting him. The moment the divorce was finalized, the FBI raided his hotel room. Julian was slapped in handcuffs and indicted on multiple federal charges, including wire, fraud, embezzlement, and corporate espionage. At the federal courthouse, the arrogant, untouchable CEO was completely gone. Julian stood in an orange jumpsuit, gaunt and trembling before the judge. He couldn't even lift his head. The gavel slammed down. 15 years in federal prison. His vicious accomplice, Chloe Bennett, didn't escape the net either. The investigation proved she was the mastermind behind registering the shell, companies, forging corporate seals, and accepting commercial bribes. Her crocodile tears and hysterical sobbing in the courtroom couldn't wash away her federal crimes. The judge sentenced her to 10 years in federal prison. Two people who thought they could defy basic human decency, using vile tactics to steal my family's blood, sweat, and tears, paid the ultimate price. Their youth and their futures were buried behind the cold steel bars of a federal penitentiary. Justice was served absolutely and mercilessly. 1 full year passed since the hurricane purged the company. Under my steady hand, strategic vision, and ruthless execution, Sterling Dynamics didn't just survive the crisis. We exploded into a new era of dominance. The high-stakes negotiations with Apollo Ventures were a historic success. They injected billions into our accounts, allowing us to finalize and launch our Boggart masterpiece, Project Orion. It was a next-generation AI microchip, entirely designed and engineered by brilliant American tech talent right here in Silicon Valley. The launch of Orion cemented Sterling Dynamics as an untouchable titan on the global tech map. The product launch gala was held at the massive Moscone Center. The flashbulbs, from hundreds of tech journalists and financial reporters, fired relentlessly. I stepped up to the center podium, bathed in the deafening applause of our investors and employees. Wearing a custom-tailored, pristine white power suit, I smiled confidently, flawlessly breaking down the revolutionary architecture of the Orion chip. The aura of power, the calm grace, and the razor-sharp intellect of a true female CEO radiated from me, utterly obliterating any lingering doubts about the heiress's ability to lead. During the Q&A, a veteran Forbes journalist stood up and boldly asked about the devastating personal betrayals I had endured the previous year. Standing in front of hundreds of people waiting for my answer, I faced my past with total serenity. I smiled slightly, looked directly into the camera lenses, and declared with iron certainty that I refused to be defined or broken by a shattered marriage or the pathetic betrayals of small people. Hardship is simply the fire that forges the steel of a true leader. That night, after the massive success of the launch party, I returned to my CEO suite at the top of Sterling Tower. I stood alone in front of the floor-to-ceiling glass, holding a crystal glass of Cabernet. I looked out over the glittering San Francisco skyline, the headlights on the Bay Bridge glowing like a river of gold, symbolizing the relentless, unstoppable flow of life. After enduring so much pain and surviving the fire, I realized a profound truth. A woman's greatest safety net in this world is absolutely not found in the Bernigote, sweet empty promises of a man, nor in a fragile piece of paper from the state. The ultimate weapon to protect yourself is financial independence, a razor-sharp mind and the pride to pull yourself out of the ashes to build your own glorious empire.